Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. Art Basel, Miami Beach, Conversations. This conversation is called Diversifying Collections. Is it? Yeah, Diversifying Collections, Indigenous Art. I'm very happy to introduce our moderator, Jamie Powell. Jamie is, Jamie, what are you? Jamie Powell is, wait, I got it, Associate Curator of Native American Art at the Hood Museum of Art in Dartmouth. Please, yes! Please join us in another round of applause for all of our speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So before I introduce the panelists, we would like to begin by acknowledging the fact that we are on the homelands of the Seminole tribe and nation, and to recognize them and the Miccosukee and other indigenous peoples who call these lands home today. We also wish to recognize the enslaved and disenfranchised peoples of color who helped build this city and its infrastructure. We'd like to thank the organizers of this event and panel who have put their time and energy into creating a space for this important conversation. And lastly, we're grateful for the custodial service and support professionals who have made this space usable for us. So to get started, let's have each of the panelists introduce themselves. Maybe we'll start at the end with John.
I'm John Lukovic, Curator of Native Arts at the Denver Art Museum.
Anine, hello, how are ya? Feeling good this afternoon? I'm Wanda Nandabush, Anishinaabe Kwe from Beausoleil First Nation, which is a little island in Georgian Bay. We call it the Caribbean of the North. It's very beautiful. And I am Wolf Clan, and I come from, my mother had 18 children, and I'm the youngest. So my mother is Anishinaabe Kwe from Beausoleil. My father is Anishinaabe Kwe from Beausoleil. She snagged him. He was like 20. She was 42. So he was pretty young and cute. My sister was really mad because she took the hottest guy on the res. But I'm really happy to be here, and we're going to get serious in a minute.
Hi, I'm Geoffrey Gibson. I'm an artist, half Cherokee, and member of the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians. And so, yeah, that's it.
No snagging stories?
Yeah, you're not going to talk about your mom's
nothing
dance
to
anyway?
share.
As Mary said, my name is Jamie Powell. In addition to being the curator at the Hood Museum of Art at Dartmouth College, I'm also a citizen of the Osage Nation. So the lack of representation of Indigenous arts in the contemporary art world is not from a lack of talent, ideas, or artistic developments by Native artists, but rather a lack of understanding and awareness by non-Native curators, collectors, and critics that is at the root of this problem. Indigenous artists are too often expected to educate their audience about the histories and representations within their work, which are assumed to be universal. What impact does this have on contemporary Indigenous art, and what are some strategies we can use to respect Indigenous art and artists? Can I ask you to speak first, Geoffrey? As the creative, talented artist on our panel.
I will say, first of all, a lot of things have changed, and these are three people who I have tremendous respect for and who have directly and indirectly given me a lot of support. I would say I think I've had a really fortunate amount of support in terms of being an artist within the Native arts community, outside of the Native arts community. I think a lot of it has to do with just my choice to be very transparent about having not grown up on a reservation, not grown up within an Indigenous community, and not trying to rely on like the living in two worlds kind of struggle, but trying to find kind of ways to negotiate that in the current times. So I think things are changing. I think everyone up here is evidence of how things are changing. And so, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
I worked on Geoffrey Gibson's current exhibition, Like a Hammer, that's traveling around right now. And Geoffrey and I had a lot of deep conversations about how it's exhausting in the contemporary art world, there is such a disconnect between, or an unrecognition or lack of knowledge about Indigenous histories, Indigenous experiences. So that way, every time he enters into a new conversation with someone who's seeing his work for the first time, most people do not get the Indigenous references in his work. And he has to give kind of like an Indian Art 101 lecture every single time he has a conversation. This is something that we talked about, and we wanted to push beyond this to really put the onus and the responsibility on the viewer to catch up. There's no reason that any Indigenous artist should ever be held back because their audience doesn't know the references. They should be free to move on just like any other artist and put the burden on others to really catch up to where they are. So that's ultimately what we did with the exhibition, but it was about kind of pushing beyond and not saddling Indigenous artists with that responsibility, because it's not a responsibility that anyone else places on any other kind of artist. And it really comes down to context. Most people in the contemporary art world are white. We'll just say it. Collectors, they don't have those references. They don't have the knowledge, the understanding of people who are different from them. Geoffrey and I were on a panel at a gallery in New York a few years ago, and I shocked a lot of people when we were talking about pop art. And I said that pop art itself is fine. The word pop art, though, I consider to be a racist term. The reason I say that is because when you say popular pop art, you're referring to popular culture. Well, ask yourself, whose popular culture? It's Euro-American white popular culture. A Campbell's soup can by Andy Warhol is fine. But if you think that everyone around the world shares the experience of that being connecting to their childhood and their own experiences, that is coming from a position of white privilege. And if you don't recognize that, that's a problem. And the idea with Indigenous arts is the experiences that Indigenous artists have in their lives that influence their art are different from the experiences of most of the collectors that are collecting their work. And that difference is important, but if you want to get into collecting Indigenous arts, you have to put in the effort. You have to try. It's not going to be easy. You have to challenge yourself to push beyond your own comfort zone and be open to learning something new.
I just want to say also, I think there's a flip side to that as well, because John and I also had conversations about, who is my audience? Like, who am I trying to talk to? And oftentimes I'm actually trying to talk to other Indigenous artists because, and I actually have no expectation of an audience of collectors to suddenly want to go and pick up and learn about the history of Native American people. I've never seen it in the history. I have no reason to expect that that's going to be the sudden cultural turn. I think John and I were really strategic in thinking about what kind of subjects to address, the writing, and also the audience, because this is really like an audience that is in formation. It's not one that currently really exists in mass, especially when you think about financial. And oftentimes people want to compare it to young African-American artists in terms of a market development, and they couldn't be more different. Historically, those stories in the United States and, of course, globally are radically different. And so John and I were trying to find, what is the best entry point for people where they could actually kind of grasp on and, move forward with the work that we were showing. Which for me was great because John never approached me as representative of anyone other than just myself and just my practice and just the materials that I'm addressing and just my specific history.
I'm just trying to swim in here somewhere. I can start with a little bit of what we're doing at the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto. In terms of, I guess Canada, maybe the country now called Canada, is in a different space, I think, than America, because we're in that truth and reconciliation post period when museums are really trying to grapple with their responsibilities to that history. And there are direct kind of recommendations of what museums should be doing. And hiring people and collecting and all those things are part of those recommendations. But I think one of the caveats is that, like Jeff is saying, how you make work for other artists, it's like we do our work for an Indigenous community as well. And I think as long as you do that, everyone has an entry point. but the ones who never have an entry point at least have an entry point. So if you start from there, I always think that we're kind of on the right path. We, at the AGO last October, we had a power vacuum, somebody left. And so I was like, here's the chance, jump in there. So I suggested to the other woman who is Romanian that works with me that we take the position together. So we share power at the top, and we develop it based on the treaty relationships that are sort of the basis of the development of Canada as a country. So we see ourselves as in a treaty relationship between Canada and First Nations, and we share power in that way. It's based in Indigenous ways of thinking about value systems like honesty, integrity, honesty being the hardest one. Who is honest in an institution? Most of the time we're always trying to maneuver or manipulate or, like these kinds of things that don't really get us anywhere as human beings. So we're trying to sort of rip the face off and just be really kind of upfront about where the museum's at, where we want to go, and have those kind of conversations that are uncomfortable but are necessary. And when we redid a bunch of floors in the permanent collection, I took a two-pronged approach because people are afraid of being ghettoized as in Indigenous art, but at the same time, they want a contextualization for their art that is Indigenous, right? So, and Indigenous doesn't really exist. You'd have to be talking about our individual nations for that to make sense. So we did two kind of approaches. One where contemporary Indigenous art sets the conversation for Canadian art, which is totally flipping the normal. So we sort of went with a contemporary Indigenous art piece, and then we built the room around that. So we have, just to give you an example of what that means, there's a Rebecca Belmore dress that she wore in a street protest in 1987 against the royals who came to visit Fergie, Fergie, and her husband, whatever his name is. So they came, and they were doing very stereotypical things, going to the fort, and then canoeing down the lake, and, da-di-da-di-da. So there were real issues about resource extraction going on very nearby and very real protests. So 12 angry women made these kinds of outfits, and they marched down the street. They were called the 12 Angry Crinolines. So this dress is half royal ball gown, and half at the back, there's like this massive beaver dam, which the debris in the beaver dam is those little royal cups that we love so much, and the little spoons and little pieces and noose clippings, and it's quite amazing as an art piece. So she remade it as an art piece to stand alone. And then we started looking at Victorian portraiture of women and how women at that time were trying to assert themselves within the white context. And then we looked at the way in which women artists were sort of starting to paint their studio spaces, which were all domestic interiors. So we started looking at, it starts changing the history, right? You start looking at art history differently when you have a different starting point. And then we also built a whole bunch of new spaces that are devoted to Indigenous art, for Indigenous artists to talk to other Indigenous artists, and then for individual nations to stand on their own within their own context. So it's kind of a complicated story, but it's the only way to do it.
I want to mention something about value systems, Indigenous value systems. Something that's also that's related to this is the value of humility. Humility is something.
I don't got any.
Yeah.
Just kidding. He's right.
Like in a lot of Indigenous communities, humility is considered to be one of the most important things that someone has to live by. There are, the Cheyenne Nation, a chief, someone who is positioned at a very senior level of authority, has to be actually the most humble. So there's a flip in the power dynamic, so that way, they let someone eat before them. They're not the first ones out there, all this kind of thing. But humility, when you're working from an Indigenous perspective and you are trying to maintain that level of humility, it's hard in the contemporary art world because then you are then challenged by your own community when you start to promote yourself. So there are cultural barriers and challenges that Indigenous artists have to face between the incompatibility of what is necessary to succeed in the contemporary art world and what is considered valuable within their own community. And it's challenging for a lot of people. Also, the idea that in order to be successful in the art world, you have to go and get a formal education, which requires leaving your own native community, leaving your family structure, leaving your support systems. And those are realistic challenges that a lot of people have. I'm thinking of like Bert Benally is a Dene artist who recently collaborated on a land art piece with Ai Weiwei on the Navajo reservation. He doesn't really leave the Navajo reservation. Ai Weiwei had to come to him to do this kind of thing because there are incredible artists doing incredible work, but they are outside of this kind of world.
Is your humility holding you back, Jeff?
I mean, I know what John is talking about, and I have those feelings, and it's interesting with interviews and published interviews. I always have to edit the voice that they edit of what I've said, and humility does come into it, because I think one of the things is anyone who identifies as a Native artist, Indigenous artist, curator, we're doing it on behalf of a larger group of people than just ourselves. But I think for me, I understand the mechanism that, I was at a dinner the other night and somebody was kind of, I think, insinuating that somehow shouldn't I be working on the reservation with my people on the reservation. And I just, in the art world, it can be quite intimidating. And I turned around and looked at her and I said, it's just not that simple. I said, I don't know why I should be regulating myself to a small plot of land that's been designated for my tribe by people other than anyone in my tribe. I think my chief, who I had a good relationship with before he passed, and he paid for my graduate education in London for 3 years. I mean, it's really an unusual story. And really what he told me was, your job is to go be successful on behalf of our tribe out in the world, like the world is yours. So I think that sort of retraining of my mind and body to think that I am entitled to the world, as opposed to being regulated to a reservation or even a set of ideas that tend to be quite narrow, has been one of the biggest parts of the work of my career for myself personally. To just realize it's like, no, you belong in Art Basel. You belong, if you want to represent the United States in Venice, like if that's what you choose to do, it's available to you. If you choose to be an artist who has no part of the commercial art world, in a weird way, coming from such an impoverished familial background, that's a really bold move to say, like, I'm rejecting the commercial art world. So I think it's, humility is definitely a factor, but I hope that everyone understands it's of your own choice to determine where you are relative to that. And it's definitely, in this moment, like, I think a strategic tool to how you want to place yourself.
And
I was just going to say something because I really loved what you just said. I used to have this block about Europe where I thought, it's kind of like it's wrong for me to desire to go there or be there, or, I just had that very immature thought in my mind. And a really amazing Anishinaabe artist, Robert Houle, who, if you don't know him, please get to know him. He's the first Indigenous curator in the 70s in North America to quit his job because they opened a sacred bundle. So he raised the consciousness around that stuff really early on. Anyway, but he's a contemporary artist, and he was doing a project in Paris called Paris Ojibwa, where he was following the path of these Indigenous artists who had gone to perform for the kings and queens in Scotland and England and France. And Delacroix had painted them, and Robert's an abstract painter and loves that whole history, and had been studying Delacroix, and he saw these drawings, and he was like, wanted to find out who these people were, and it turns out they live like very close to us. So he invited all these Nish to Paris, and I'd never been, and I never wanted to go. I was like adamant, I will never go to Paris. I was so dumb, because when And then when I arrived, I had like 104 fever and got really sick, but then still traveled around with everyone under a fever. And which is interesting because they ended up dying of smallpox, so I thought there was something spiritually happening there, some kind of connection. But it was amazing to walk through Paris with 12 Anishinaabe artists and people and realize that we had been coming there forever, whether as captives or as free artists. And those artists were revolutionary in the sense that they were chasing their dreams. They wanted to travel. They found traveling one way to practice their art because it was, banned in our country, so they could do their ceremonies there. And they found a way to, get free of the kind of over-Christianization that was happening in their reserve lands. So I think, it really taught me something, that these spaces are actually, we have a history there.
Yeah, and I think one of my biggest pet peeves when Native artist exhibitions and artists are written about is that there was recently a review of a show at the National Museum of the American Indian Space in New York City. It was Native artists working with video and light works. And basically the review was like, can you believe it? They have video cameras and like they're aware of installation. And this sort of thing that it's like, oh my gosh, a Choctaw man in Paris, or like, how many times I've had to hear being the first Native American in a graduate program in London. I think it is significant. Maybe it is representative of achievement, but those kind of broad statements dismiss really, I think, the kind of importance of breaking that glass barrier, right? Because there was never really a barrier there to begin with. It has to do, I think, with what happens. For me, for instance, I had a piece that sold at, I believe it was Christie's, in the contemporary section on like a Thursday night at like 8 p.m. or whatever time is supposed to be like a good time. And I remember getting phone calls from people saying how significant that was to see a Native American artist not in a Native American auction, and I knew that was important, and I think that was like, it's like, okay, but for me, there's a million things to do, so it's just like check, it's like move on to the next thing, and but yeah, and I hope that I'm not the first, and I hope I'm not the last, I should say.
There's a big not movement in terms of an organized movement, but just a moment in time here where there are Indigenous people who are staking claim in what have become, whether fairly or not, historically white spaces. I'm thinking of not just in the art world, but like Philip Deloria becoming in over 300 years, the first Native full professor at Harvard University. It just happened this year, first time. Chinupa Hanska Luger is currently developing a project where he's going to create a settlement in Plymouth, England, a form of reverse colonization, where he's inviting other Indigenous artists to literally occupy a section of Plymouth, England. It kind of going back across the seas and challenging that narrative, or where even just the places where Indigenous people are expected to be. And I think that's really important for us to recognize, is that a place like this is a place where Indigenous artists should be. Jamie and I spent most of the day walking around the fair here. There's 5 booths that have Indigenous artists represented, and 3 of them have Geoffrey's work. So there's only 2 other booths with 2 other Indigenous artists who are represented here in this fair. There are others over at Pulse, but that's it.
Who are the 2? Is it Jean and...
Jean Quick-to-See-Smith and...
Brad Callhammer.
Brad Callhammer.
And then Gina Adams, who I believe is here.
Yeah.
Her work
she has work over at the Pulse Fair.
But one thing that I think we've been trying to do in this conversation is to kind of complicate the narrative, and people's expectations of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous artists are often very homogenized and based on these pop cultural representations, mascots, things that we expect from Indigenous people. And then we've also been talking about kind of the difference between representing our communities and being accountable to our communities, and I think those are 2 very different things. And the words often get used, I my family says that I represent them and I represent my community. I only speak for myself. I'm accountable to my community. And I think, Geoffrey's work really speaks to that. But I think that there's still work to be done because, and tell me if I'm wrong, but people talk about you as a Native artist, and that's important. But there's also other aspects of your identity that go into your work that sometimes get glossed over because it's as if you're only allowed to be one thing. It's too complicated if you're more than just an Indigenous artist.
And the way that I handled that was to saturate that to the point where now when I'm having conversations, people are like, okay, this has been printed many times, this has been discussed many times, what have you not talked about? And this is my opportunity. And as an artist, I think, you really have no idea what the future brings. There's no way to control it. There's so many things out of your hands. So for me, very early on, whether I was Indigenous, queer, whatever, just as an artist, I was like, this is really about who can actually just endure. Like, who can actually just continue making work and just continue to develop a practice. I talk about and I'm aware of all the gaps and the challenges for me specifically, but literally, I teach. I've taught for almost 20 years now. And for artists who I meet, who I really think they truly are an artist in their core, this is what they're meant to do, I just tell them, I was like, look, 90% of this is just hanging in there and just like, when someone comes at you, listen and just let it affirm what you believe in. Some of it's going to be great advice for you to take, but really, it's a big game. I mean, we're asking people to let us. When I say we, I'm talking about artists. Let us show you our vision, and we want you to support me in doing this. I mean, that's a huge thing to ask anybody, and I don't take it for granted. I feel very committed to my community. I feel very committed to my family, and I also feel very committed to my audience, which once you enter into the commercial art world, that means something incredibly different. Institutional art world means something different. I think it's, I don't know. I'm just gonna stop.
I was just working on the solo exhibition of Rebecca Belmore's that you weren't able to come and see, unfortunately, but you've written nicely about her work. But one thing that it's interesting, because I think about these questions like in framing an artist, and a contemporary artist at a large, huge museum. And I think I decided to go with my interest in her work, which was much more about the kind of shitty political situation we find ourselves in today, and how much I have found her work to address major issues of our time and who we are as human beings. And I felt like her kind of work is necessary. Everybody needs it, not just Indigenous people. Everybody needs to look at what we value and who we are as human beings and where we want to go. And so we really forefronted her as a contemporary artist, sort of making work about our time. But it always says she's an Anishinaabe because that's super clear in her work and it's super clear in her bio as well. So it's not like we're hiding it or anything like that. It's just so ever present that I didn't feel like I needed to make it about that necessarily. And I think it is because she's an Anishinaabe that her work is about water, it's about land, it's about humanity. It's like they're one and the same.
She's another example that, I mean, I can't tell you how many times I say to other institutions when they're like, who should we be looking at? And I'm like, you should do a solo exhibition of Rebecca Belmore. Like this is somebody...
It's open for touring, by the way.
Like globally, one of the best artists working. I don't care who you are, you look at this work, and I find myself, when I'm conceiving like new bodies of work, I look at her work and I'm like, I don't entirely know what she does, but she can command a space and make you feel intimidated and loved at the same time. She's amazing. And I think she has been operating for her career is how long now? She's got to be...
It's like 40 years.
Yeah. So certainly 3 times with support and definitely without support.
30 years. I just aged her a decade.
And I think as an artist, like that has to be your commitment. You have to be committed to your practice no matter what. You have to be committed to developing it, making work, and even the part of like putting it in front of people and be willing to like listen to what they say. It's a big part of just being a part of the larger world.
Geoffrey talked about, brought up the question, who should we collect? Who should we look at? All these things. These are questions that, are asked all the time, but there was a recent study that talked about the major institutions in the United States and what artists are they collecting, and found that the artists come from 5 galleries. And it's because the people on their board buy from those 5 galleries. And that it basically creates an artificial sense of what the art world is. And everyone here knows that there's more than 5 galleries out there. Look a walk around here. And we're even telling you that Indigenous artists aren't even represented well here. So there is so much more to the art world than just what is here. So who do you collect? Who do you look at? Well, look at the institutions that are doing this well. Look at the institution, like the work of the curators out there who are dedicating themselves to Indigenous arts. Go look through the annual reports of those institutions, and when they highlight their major acquisitions over the last year, look at who the artists are for that. Look at the shows that they're doing. There's at any time the Met, I love the Met, I love the curators there, they're friends of mine, but anytime the Met does something, the New York media says it's the first time it's ever been done. I mean, the Met just incorporated Indigenous arts to the American wing for the first time in their history. Well, the Denver Art Museum has been doing it since 1925. The Brooklyn Museum, right across the river, has been doing it for nearly as long. I mean, there's more than just the Met. There's more than just the Whitney or MoMA. A curator from the Denver Art Museum in 1941 co-curated with Renee Arnoncourt at MoMA the Indian Art of the United States exhibition, which is some of the first time that Rothko and Pollock and various others saw Indigenous arts and were inspired by the idea of there being a true American art that is different from what's coming out of Europe. I mean, there's so much to look at there, but there are institutions that are not the big ones necessarily. Even though, Denver Art Museum, we like to think we are among them to some degree, but we realize we're not on one of the coasts. But look at the Denver Art Museum, look at the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Mass. Look at the Seattle Art Museum or the Portland Art Museum. Look at the Art Gallery of Ontario or the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts. Look at the Winnipeg Art Gallery. Look at
the newly renovated Hood Museum of Art.
The newly
at
renovated
Dartmouth
Hood
College.
Museum, yes, which is opening their new permanent exhibitions in January 26th.
January 26th, coming up. Yeah.
Did you just say primitive?
No?
Oh,
No.
we have.
No, that word never comes out of my mouth.
So one of the things that you're talking about is, these kind of instances where we can count the number of shows that have been at these institutions. And I've seen both Geoffrey's show at the Denver Art Museum and the Rebecca Belmore show at Art Gallery of Ontario. And what really struck me in both of these institutions was that there was that kind of institutional backing for these major shows where they were getting all of the publicity, they were getting the recognition, and they were given premium space. I think space is so important within museums. And when I stepped off the elevator for the Rebecca Belmore show, and I expected to have to go find the gallery or where it was, and I stepped off the elevator and it's oh no, it's the entire 5th floor of this museum. There was space for you to appreciate the work. And even just that recognition of this institution is giving this space to recognize this work is very exciting. In the Hood Museum, when you walk into our 2nd floor galleries, you walk into the Contemporary Native Art Gallery. You have to walk through that gallery. You have to walk through contemporary Black and African diaspora art to get to the European art. People are upset about that. I was excited because for too long, we've had to walk through painting after painting of white guys on horses. I get it, you like them, I like horses too. But these
I'm pretty sure they like native guys on horses even more.
Oh yeah, especially when they're shirtless and look really defeated. Those are the best.
You all know that one, right?
When they're on the verge of extinction,
Ironically,
that's the best.
the Denver Art Museum just acquired James Earl Fraser's
Just real
End of the
sad.
Trail.
Real sad.
Right, but it's those sad moments, and also we joke about it, and people like to talk about those histories and the violence, and that context is important. But one of the greatest things about the work that Geoffrey and other contemporary Native artists are doing is that they are looking to the future with hope and joy, and the idea of, filling museums with these spaces and having my Osage kids, your daughter, Gigi, like walking into museums and seeing work that reflects people from their communities, things that make them feel proud and not like they aren't represented. That's important.
That's crucial because, when you talk about diversifying the workforce, diversifying, the staff that's in museums, you also have to diversify the collections. And that's really, I guess that's back to the topic, diversifying collections.
I planned that.
Because, people need to be able, when I say people, I mean collectively. Anyone needs to be able to go into an institution and see themselves represented somehow and see themselves respected. And, like whether their background, whether they're Latinx, whether they're African American, whether they're American Indian or Asian, or whatever their background, they should be able to go into institutions and see that they are part of it and to know that they are accepted, that they are welcome, that, this is for them. Museums always want to diversify our audience. Well, if you don't change the practices that you have and you just show old white dead artists, how is that truly serving the audience? How are you providing something to an audience to make them feel welcome and respected and honored to be there? And that's something that we always have to keep in mind. But diversifying your collections is one way to do it. And I will also, this is something I tell colleagues at other institutions all the time, just because your institution has not historically collected Indigenous arts, you don't have to go back, you don't have to collect all this historic material from the 19th century or early 20th century. Just start today. There's no excuse for why you can't start today. For our collectors out there, there's no excuse why you can't start today. You don't have to go back and fill in the gaps in time. Just start today and make a difference in the lives of artists who are working today.
And don't worry if it's not very expensive. It will increase in value in time.
The market is ridiculously underpriced, so there's value there.
When you were talking about Rebecca's show being in the entire 5th floor, and I said that she can take up space, like it's her work. I mean, you can't stick it in a small space. You just physically, to show her as an artist. And that's what I say when it's like, when I say to artists, like, you have to commit to your work. If you want to see your work in different spaces outside of these historic ones, make the work for that space. And also, I think, a lot of times I think, we're in a moment right now where we have Indigenous curators, we have Indigenous writers. People are beginning to try to figure out what does it mean to think critically from an Indigenous perspective. So for somebody like Wanda, I mean, thank God that Rebecca exists. Like, you need artists who excite you. Otherwise, you're going to be curating group shows forever of like modest-sized pieces, and we're always going to be in group shows of Native American artists. And that's something that I think people expect it to go into the past, or at least it could become topical rather than that we're just kind of put together under some sort of umbrella term.
Yeah, we've been very committed to solo shows because we have the space for it, and we have the 60 years of artists creating work. So we actually have enough artists that have enough body of work to show. Beyond even Rebecca, and younger artists are just insanely exploding. There are so many. I don't even know them all, which is unusual. I feel like I know everyone, but I don't, this next generation. And I'm older than I look. There's something about group shows, though. I still do group shows, and I do a lot of touring group shows for the specific reason of wanting to write other art histories through group shows, and also wanting to get into the deep side of the philosophies of our work, which I feel can be done in a group show way that can't be done in a solo show, because they're different reasons. But I understand what you're saying. Like, I wouldn't do a show of like, these are the native men or whatever, of the 1930s, something like that. But I'll do something called Fifth World, which is like really about examining some of our prophecies and some of the way in which artists are picking up traditional materials and doing them in radically different ways. There's a young artist, Ursula Johnson, who just won the Sobey Prize. And she, has been trained on her grandmother with traditional Mi'kmaq basket weaving. But her first thing was to weave her body into a basket and then, break free of it. And she did this project where she did like busts of you. So she went around the country and she's done 200 of them. She wants to do many, many more. But, and she weaves the black ash all the way over you and over your head. And she talks to you really gently while, in case you're having a minor moment of panic. I'm a little claustrophobic. But I was feeling very peaceful in there, and there was all these birds kind of like, I could hear birds when I was inside of it. So maybe I felt caged in some weird way. So she was finishing the basket up north by a river, and she said as soon as she tied the last string, these birds just burst into the sky. And so she had to call me because it was mine that she was doing when that happened. And she's like, I just remembered you were thinking about birds. Anyway, I got off topic there. But not really, because this is part of process, this is part of thinking and ways of doing things that I want to get at in the work that is not so easy in a Western context.
Speaking of Ursula, she talked about this at a symposia that Wanda organized at the Art Gallery of Ontario,
Abaquad. You should all come if you want to hear from artists from around the world, Indigenous artists talking to each other about their work. It'll be next fall. It's every fall for the next 7 years at the AGO in Toronto.
Yeah, so I want to use that to lead into a conversation about global indigeneity and global contemporary art. But I also want to tell a story about Ursula because she was doing an a performance piece, and she wanted to like scrape a hide, but she'd never done it before. And so she like went to a fabric store, like Fabric Barn or something, I think she said.
Oh, can I just tell one part of that before you finish? It's because she was invited to a craft residency. They didn't know that that's not the kind of work she does, so that's where it begins. So they thought she could do hide and stuff.
Yeah, so she was doing this performance and she couldn't find anything except for this like really cheap fake faux fur, like acrylic and polyester. And then she was just sitting there scraping it, and people would come into the gallery and ask her questions, and she said, oh, it's really traditional method, and I learned this from my ancestors, and it was just, and so there's like kind of that playfulness that she has too, and I think a lot of artists do too, where like it's not always like spiritual moments, but there's like a lot of humor and that like the just like kind of the intellectual generosity of artists and like this conversation in some communities is like that's what people talk about when they talk about ceremony, and that like this knowledge exchange is ceremony in a certain way, but I think we have to cut short. And not cut short, we're going over, so we need to open it up for questions, but maybe somebody will ask about global contemporary art.
Right here.
Hello. Alicia Smith. I'm showing at Pulse Play.
It's wonderful, I've seen it.
Thank you. Earlier in the conversation, you all were discussing challenges for Native American artists, and Jamie had brought up accountability and being accountable to your communities. And one challenge that I keep seeing over and over that I wonder if Geoffrey has any thoughts on is how much we can share.
How much we can what?
How much we can share.
How much we can share.
With other people, with
Yeah.
people that aren't in our communities. In the video, as a matter of fact, that's in Pulse Play right now, when I first approached people from those communities about sharing a story, a lot of them told me, no, I can't record my voice telling this story because it's not my story, it's our story. And so I was wondering, like, how do you negotiate that? Like, how much you can share, how much you shouldn't share?
I mean, I've anyone who's had a real in-depth conversation with me knows that I'll always say there are certain things I would never do, I would never touch, And I think if anyone ever really had issue with something I was doing, I would take it very seriously. I think a big break for me was when I realized that for me there's a big difference between cultural practice and art making. They have completely different goals. One is totally manufactured. I mean, they're both manufactured in certain ways, but a contemporary art world is really thrives in a place of experimentation and challenging and confrontation. I think in many of our communities, there's not a contemporary art world. For instance, in central Mississippi, there is not a contemporary art world on the reservation. So Like a Hammer did go to the Mississippi Museum of Art in Jackson, and I think is closing very soon. We worked incredibly hard to get young Choctaw people to come and see the exhibition, and they did. And my father went down and led a tour with the wife of the chief during his lifetime. And so I think you have to see it as part of your practice. It's a continual negotiation, and I always think making the problem the subject makes for better work, meaning make the negotiation the subject of something, because that's something that people don't really understand. So if you can talk about why these negotiations are really important, why they're relevant and contemporary, and I think it can be really, really interesting. And I think that this idea of didactic language or didactic thought, like all the interesting stuff happens in between, and that's exactly what negotiating is,
The level of accountability, just to jump in real quick, this is something that, like certainly artists feel, but also as curators, especially I feel as a non-Indigenous curator, I have an extreme amount of accountability to Indigenous people, where, there's a lot of new institutions that are starting to show Indigenous arts and making a lot of missteps. Just the fact, and they're getting called out on it. And, I've had people even on our staff say, like, aren't you always, like, worried about, like, whatever you do is going to be criticized? And I said, that's the way I always want it to be. I always want to walk on eggshells, because the second you feel like you are comfortable, that's when you get complicit and that's when you make mistakes. I always want to feel that level of responsibility and accountability to not myself, but to others. When I do an exhibition, my primary audience first are the local Indigenous community. When I want people from our community to come into the institution and feel that it's done right, that it's done respectfully, and also to the source communities in which the art is being created. I feel like that level of responsibility, and because of that, I also know that I shouldn't know it all, I can't know it all, and that there's a necessity for reaching out to source communities and to artists and to Indigenous people to get input, to get buy-in, to get permission. But there's also stories that are very inappropriate for me to share. And knowing where that line is challenging, and it takes time, it takes effort. But again, I never want to feel like I can just plow through and do whatever I want to. I always want that level of accountability, because I think it's what keeps everything, moving in the right direction.
There's when I was a NAGPRA research assistant for a number of years in the early 90s, and I remember someone, and I was never interested in knowing about ceremony that was not part of my background, but I remember someone said to me, like the kind of anthropological or archaeological interest of fetishizing what happens in ceremonial spaces really stuck with me. And someone said to me, they were like, you actually don't want to know because you can't handle it. Like, there's information that you haven't been trained to know how to handle, medicines that you shouldn't be touching, that you shouldn't, it's not a game. And I think that for me has always been something that it's like, I know by this point in my life what I'm trained to handle when it comes to that sort of stuff and what I'm not. And I know I actually thrive almost not knowing about it and respecting it,
Can I? Yeah. Actually, I was just observing the two comments actually I came across. One was challenge in your own community. When an Indigenous artist is evolving himself or herself, I think one of the panelists raised this issue. So I was just referring to one of the very good example which happened in India. There was a person called Janghar Shyam, and he was a god artist, and he was patronized by a Japanese art collector and exhibitionist. And once Janghar started experimenting with his own style, eventually he evolved his whole entire community to work on that point of view and the style. And now we have whole Janghar Shyam school. So this is, I couldn't understand when the whole concept of challenge within the community arrived over here. And the most beautiful part of it, like now Janghar Shyam school has evolved in 3 different stages. So you have the native art, you have the experimental art, and also you have so-called pop art in it. So when Shyam school has evolved so much, so why this thing, apprehension happened? Like maybe it's a comment or maybe I have mistook it or misunderstood it. So I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Just trying to grasp your question a little more. You're apprehensive, or we seem apprehensive about? Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I think you were the one to say that, or was it me? Was it you?
Yeah, I think
But
it's
you're
just
talking
something,
about
I think it's
contemporary
something
on
that
the
a lot of artists do feel. And I think what you're describing, the example you're describing, seems kind of like a social practice model. And I know a number of other artists who have done this, you know, starting schools and communities. I think trying to find a way, like for instance, for myself, since I didn't grow up on the reservation in central Mississippi, it was important for me that when I do engage, I engage as who I am, you know, as an artist. I don't want to disregard a part of myself when I cross that line onto the reservation. I shot a video a little over a year and a half ago working with a transsexual woman on the reservation. And that came through me trying to work with my nephew, who identifies as female. What was really interesting is the video is actually about what's going on with trans rights in the state of Mississippi right now for all trans people. I mean, she happens to be on the reservation, but it's really about trans rights in Mississippi and in this particular political moment. So I think apprehension can be a good thing. You know, sometimes I think artists are just way too quick to just like, I don't know, be an astronaut. You know, I'm like, well, you know, or in the sciences where there are real scientists doing this work in depth. So for an artist to just kind of skim the surface, I don't know. Anyways, I'm gonna stop right now, but.
Thank you all so much for this great panel, and I look forward to seeing what you all do at the Hood when you open in January. A question is, can you all comment or, you know, kind of give us a little bit of analysis of the Sam Durant piece at the Walker and how your take is on that?
Is that a not it?
Here's where you can come in and say something.
No comment? I'm going to deflect part of the question to talk to a much broader issue, and that is institutions need to understand their community in the broadest sense. And the Indigenous community in the Minneapolis area has, for a long time, felt ignored and invisible within their own community. And there is certainly, you know, historically, I think had been a disconnect between larger institutions and the you know, the beliefs of that community and the feelings of that community, and even just the political history is certainly challenging. And so I think the main thing I just want to leave it with is that in order to avoid missteps, you need to be way out ahead of it. You need to truly understand the community that you're serving, that you're part of. And that's, I think, a really important part, is that institutions need to be part of a community. There has to be a lot of give and take. You have to give to the community, but you also have to learn from your community. And understanding who your audience is and the audience that you want to have, and what is respectful of them. Knowing things like that can create situations where you can avoid situations that you don't even know are an issue yet. And I think that's ultimately where things went, is that there was just non-recognition of the conflict or the challenges there. And so I think a lot of the issues beyond the immediate issue is just the disconnect between the community and the institutions in the area, which are very avoidable.
There's also this kind of this nodule, this conflict about freedom as artists to create, that I think is butting up against the kind of historic and continued ignorance and segregation of Indigenous people, period, everywhere we are. So, and finally, I think Indigenous people have a kind of voice that people aren't used to. Us being able to sort of rally and quite quickly make something, you know, a monument torn down, or an artist feel uncomfortable, or protest outside of an exhibition because the artist might actually be white. You know, all these kinds of things that have been happening everywhere are very complicated, because on the one hand, you kind of want artists to feel free, but we have to acknowledge the context in which that freedom exists is like an unfreedom for others. And so that's the conflict that we have to address and deal with, and it's going to be dealt with in very different ways.
And I think Sam Duran is a good artist. I think that's a bad piece. And it was a bad location and bad timing. And
It was a tone deaf piece.
yeah, and I think it was really, anytime you're going to deal with historical specificity, I mean, I think the broader story has to be a big part of how that decision is made. But it also, I just blanked out on something, but one thing that, you know, in terms of like practices and institutions of forming advisory boards, you know, we're in a moment right now where maybe institutions are thinking we should have an advisory board. That moment could pass, as we saw like in the 90s, and we could revert back to old habits of institutional practice. I think there's a lot of conversation right now about how to secure a future for not just Indigenous artists, but many artists and kind of complexities of these communities. I think it's up to us, and by us, it's not a racial thing, it's people who feel that this is the way institutions should work. Don't let this moment pass. Like, fight to be on a board, fight to be a trustee, spend your money in this direction. That's what institutions listen to, especially if we look at the trends of institutions right now. The financial side of it is so crucial to whose dollars are being spent, how they're being spent, and what they're speaking to. So I think it's also a generational thing. You know, I don't know how far apart we are all in age, but I would say my experience of the late 80s and early 90s was really a very open, very inclusive future. And so now those people are in positions where we can actually make that happen. You know, they're actually curators, they're actually museum directors. So that kind of old guard, we were talking about this earlier tonight, that kind of old guard is has moved on in many places. So, but I think it's everyone's responsibility. I mean, you should really fight for those positions to have a voice within the institution.
You know, it also, you know, I don't know most of you, but I'm sure that most of you have some kind of influence, whether that is, you know, through connections you have, through financial means that you may have, but sometimes it's really just being the loud voice in the room and being persistent. There's a collector who passed away about 2 months ago named Lauren Lipson, who he had some means, but not like, you know, not a ridiculous amount of means, but he was persistent. And he had such a dedication to Indigenous arts and artists of color who have been marginalized or underrepresented. And his sole goal was to get them into major institutions. And he would get tickled to death when he finally got Wendy Red Star's work into the Met or into the Whitney, or got Marie Watt's work into the Albright Knox collection. Like, that was just like, he almost felt it like he was sticking it to the man every time he got an artist of color into a major institution. And that's what he spent all of his money. Like, he lived kind of almost in squalor so he could do this. He was like spending ridiculous amounts of money just to stick it to the man and kind of subvert the system that has been operating for so long, because he just was pushing it. So I challenge all of you to take up that mantle. He's no longer with us. We need other angel patrons to support these Indigenous artists and other artists of color and push their work relentlessly to major institutions. Because the reality is most museums do not have a lot of resources for acquisitions. You know, every once in a while we'll have, like, you know, an opportunity here and there, but our bread and butter are donations from private collectors. And if you don't have those works in your collection, they're not going to get into institutions. And that's something that everyone needs to be. We need to all partner. We need to be, like, all help each other kind of do this. And I certainly do this with collectors in Denver who have shown a commitment to the institution, but also an interest in Indigenous arts, where, you know, we're working together to build a collection that is promised to the institution, that I know will be coming at some point. So, you know, there are other curators certainly who do that as well. I'm sure you all do. So I think we all have this responsibility to work together to change the future. And it's kind of like what Geoffrey does with his work. He makes the work that he wants to exist in the future. Well, we all need to do the work now for changing the way things move forward.
My name's Shara Giles. I want to thank all of you for the work that you're doing and in making sure that spaces are indigenized, that there are spaces available. So it's great to see someone that looks like us in a space like this, but in telling that story. And at the same time, I am actually Muskogee Creek and Cherokee from Oklahoma, but I work at the Atotiki Museum, the Seminole Tribes Museum. So invite all of you out because you're in this space. The Miccosukis have their museum just about 30 minutes west of here, and then this Big Cypress Reservation is where the Atotiki Museum. So I invite you all out to visit, as well as when you're thinking about spaces or you're thinking about artwork or thinking about other things in an indigenous perspective, come and look and come and talk to people. So with that, and in particular, Geoffrey, and the work that you're doing, in this time and age where people see us as less than, see us as mascots in world of cultural appropriation, how is your art transforming that or having that conversation so that someone can look at your art piece but then turn around and not wear a headdress because that's not culturally relevant and important and very discriminatory to us as indigenous people. So I just wanted to see how your work is transforming those conversations, because we're not seeing, like I said, someone at your stature in this level, but people are. So how do you have that conversation in this community, in this space?
I mean, I tell other artists, well, specifically Native artists, I'm like, you don't have to deal with people's ignorance, just dismiss them. And put all your energy into the world that you want to see. You know, it's like, that's exactly what I'm doing. I've made the life that I want to live, and I know exactly where that comes from. And I think it's sort of like, you know, in terms of like the mascot issue, one thing that, it took me a long time to get to this point, so it's not, I'm saying it like it's easy. But really, I realized one day, that mascot doesn't actually represent me. It represents the ignorance of other people. It doesn't represent me. I'm gonna not let this make me feel like I'm looking at any representation of myself. And my job is not to convince or convince people to suddenly have respect for me. You know, I think that deep-rooted fear of difference is something that I actually cannot confront. I actually can't change it. It's on a very much more intimate level that I feel like I can inspire people, I can provide opportunity, I can direct people to look at what I think is really strong and powerful happening in the world. I can use every platform that's available to me in that way. But, you know, I can say that I think my work has a kind of editing ability just on its own. The people who have chosen to support me, to acquire my work, they're really smart, cool people. They're just people who I think share a similar vision and who are like, I'm in a position to put this on the front cover of something, or to write a poem about it and publish it, or to give an exhibition of Geoffrey's work. The 2 catalogs that have come out this past year with John and I, sitting down, and Jen Mergel is here, and Jen Mergel wrote my biographical narrative, and I mean, that's a lot of hours. But I will say, when it was done, I was like, oh my gosh, I am reading that biography that I've read of so many other artists that will never have to be written again. It's literally like, I was born here, here's a picture of me and my grandmother, here's a picture of me with my artwork early on. But it's there and it's documented. In that catalog, we talked about the writers who should write about the work. Ultimately, we did have an Indigenous writer who ultimately could not fulfill the commitment, and that's nothing bad about that. We ended up with 5 writers? I don't remember. I think 5 writers, but they're great writers.
And 2 of them are Indigenous, from Cherokee Nation.
Oh, that's true, yeah. That's
Yeah.
true. And so I think I really try not to think from the perspective of being oppressed. I try to imagine myself being fully entitled and make from that perspective. Yeah.
And we're out of time, but I would like to encourage, if you haven't already, to go see Geoffrey's work in the booths at Sycamore Jenkins, Kavi Gupta, and Roberts projects. Since there are so few Indigenous artists being represented, I will also name the others. You can go see Gina Adams' show being shown at the Pulse venue at the Akola Griffin booth. Brad Kallhammer is being showed at Jack Shaman. And here in this venue, and also at this venue, is work by the amazing Jean-Quick Smith at Garth Greenan. So, and we hope that we will have more artists to talk about next year. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.